kaya. Yan karich wajak nunga mot kayan karak nij buja. I acknowledge we're on Nunga Buja. The work that we've done together that we're going to talk about today touches the lives of Aboriginal people way more disproportionately than others. So I think it's really important that we acknowledge we're on Noongar country. And also the kind of, I guess, irony of a couple of white blokes talking about Aboriginal spaces without Aboriginal people in the room feels weird. So I'll just put that out there. The first time that I met Pascal face-to-face was outside Tranby. Tranby is one of the drop-in centres that rough sleepers access here in WA. So I'm flicking. And as we walked through the kind of front doors of the place, they've had a really nice refurbishment recently. This is the place. And I looked over at Pascal's big, wide eyes. I was like, oh, that's right, this isn't normal. I'm really lucky that I've worked in homelessness for 15 years before turning to design, and so those spaces feel kind of normal to me, but for Pascal, it's a little bit different. Tranby, I guess, sees about 60 people a day. People are coming in for breakfast, for support, for a bunch of other things. It's the sort of place that has an energy that just might kick off at any moment, just a spilled cup of tea away from kind of going off. The workers there are fast, clever. They wear earpieces to talk to each other so that they can see across the room and direct kind of the gentle piece of support, or they can kind of diffuse a potential situation really quickly so that people can get the kind of support they need. Pascal and I were there for kind of the first set of observations that we were doing around this project that we were delivering in homelessness. We were there to kind of observe the space, to see how workers worked in them, but also to talk to people experiencing homelessness about whether a digital solution could make a bigger difference for them in these spaces. And so we were there to do some interviews. And some of the first people we met, I'll call them Jack and Sarah, were a couple who had been sleeping on a building site for about a week behind the plastic, and through a series of events had lost their stuff. This happens really regularly in homelessness spaces. And they'd lost their stuff and had turned up to Tranby with their little backpacks to try to work out what to do next and to try to find accommodation. Jack had been to Tranby before, and he wanted to get a referral to one of the crisis accommodation places, which is the only crisis accommodation place that takes couples. And so the Tranby workers were helping them to fill out the forms that were necessary for that referral. What the workers told us is that there was probably going to be 20 applications for one or two places for that night. And I suppose this is the first so I suppose this is the kind of environment that they wanted, right? We knew that Jeff and Sam were going to have to wait, and just wait until the service provider at 10 o'clock would shut off applications and then make a decision who was most in need and who would get the place.
Thanks, Jethro. So, I guess why this topic? You know, what is there to learn from the most challenging users, who are usually those ignored edge cases, those who are generally ignored by more commercially minded products? So we think there is a lot to be learned from working with these users, and which we're going to talk about today and share that with you. But not least because it reinforces that core UX truism that operating from assumptions and relying on our empathy to design is, no matter how well-meaning, is generally not a good idea.
So a few years ago, I was lucky enough to work on a project with the Department of Communities around a kind of systems design project. This is the one part of the final blueprint of that project. And one of the things that popped out of that co-design process with the sector and with people with lived experience was this idea of a digital solution that did one of two things. So the brief for this systems change project was that the Department of Communities had been doing some work with people experiencing homelessness, and they had been saying things like, I am bounced around the system, I don't know where my applications are going, I'm getting lots of wrong doors, I'm having to tell my story over and over again. Just this kind of really awful user experience for people who are in the moments of the most significant trauma. So these two products popped out, these two platforms. One, which we called the Front Door Web App, that was kind of the working title, and the one-story assessment. Basically what it would allow people to do is to see what beds were currently available in the system, to make application to that, and to tell their story once, and to have control over that so that they could then share it on with other service delivery. And that's the product that we'd been working on. So that's where Anthology comes in. Anthology alongside Innovation Unit, which is where I am, Anglicare WA and Info Exchange, who do a lot of work in homelessness tech over East. We developed a consortium to try to help build this product.
Move on to next.
And so, what are high complexity users and what are we talking about? Basically, people experiencing homelessness are going to face a bunch of the kind of accessibility things that we would normally talk about around disability or those sorts of things, but they're going to bring extra stuff. Those things might be things like having low literacy, they might be hearing voices, they might be living with extremely high levels of stress, trauma and chaos. They're often completely overwhelmed by all of that. There's simultaneously a lack of trust in established institutions and resignation that, you know, they've got all my data, so why should I care? Intoxication might make products hard to use, and on top of that, like smartphone ownership is really prevalent, so more than 90% of people who are rough sleeping have a smartphone, but those might get broken, stolen, they're very often without data. Despite that, people are really resourceful. They use their relationships to find the information that they need and the resources that they need. And so that led our team to take a first principles approach to this work and to really kind of start from fresh when we were thinking about accessibility. And that meant a more full co-design process. So we knew that we needed to involve the sector, we needed to involve experts, we needed to involve people with lived experience directly in the work that we were doing. As complexity increases, single decision makers or single audiences become incapable of making the decisions that are necessary, so we need to involve lots of others in the work. But co-design doesn't mean be directed by the user. Co-design means all of us together, because we all bring something different to the piece. This co-design process has lasted 5 months so far, from observations to interviews, through walkthroughs and testing. So there's been lots and lots of work done across that, and you'll see some of that work today. And as the project has gone on, we've realised that the principles that we've been developing start to mirror some of these trauma-informed design principles that are popping up from some technologists overseas. This set here is from the Orbits project, with Chain and End Cyber Abuse, who are looking at FDV and particularly violence against women in online spaces. And they're developing these digital principles that need to be in place for trauma-informed design to work. So trauma impacts us all really differently. It's a well-known paradigm in human services, but it's delivering it practically is complicated. And that trauma is a really common experience for people experiencing homelessness. So when traumatic situations happen to us and we internalise them, we can feel frightened, trapped, abandoned, ashamed, and that leads us to respond in ways that are easy to misunderstand, whether we lash out, or we run away, or we close down. So this is fairly new and only just developing in design spaces, particularly in architecture. So, but it was good to see that some of these principles were kind of mirroring what we found. And this is what we feel like we learned. 1, put me in charge. So looking at agency. 2, taking safety seriously. 3, being radically accessible. 4, connecting me with others. 5, giving me real hope. Social exclusion strips you of your agency. The systems that you tend to encounter have been designed for the services, or they've been designed for risk mitigation. And that very rarely takes into account your own needs, and the lack of resourcing in those sectors means it's very hard for them, even despite the best intentions, to do anything about it. So when we were presented an opportunity for greater control by people experiencing homelessness through this app, it was warmly embraced. We developed service information pages that told you more than the referral criteria. It showed you photos of the place that you were going to be staying at. It told you what you might kind of expect about the rules. It gave you who you might be staying with, and it made the experience predictable rather than confusing. And we added options for feedback about the services that you had accessed, so you could have some voice back into the system that you felt really powerless in. So I also remember that we spoke to a team at Crisis Care. So Crisis Care is the kind of overnight crisis helpline that you'll call. Often FDV is the kind of situations that they're picking up. And whilst kind of white or kind of older homeless guys are the normal face that we'd experience of homelessness, the largest amount of homeless people are women escaping family domestic violence. So the workers there told us to imagine that they'd got a call late at night of someone trying to escape FDV. That person would have few belongings. The workers might then advise her to get rid of her phone, because 99% of perpetrators are now tracking people using smartphone technologies. Embedded tracking devices are pretty normal now in FDV relationships. And so beyond quick exit pages, we had to take that into account. We had to give access while allowing people to remain anonymous and ensure services could retain secrecy of location. We had to make sure that people couldn't stay logged in case perpetrators might impersonate them to contact FDV services directly. But safety is more than physical safety. It's also about the trans kid who looks through the list of options about how to write their name and their pronouns and doesn't see themselves represented and says, this isn't for me. Or the Aboriginal person who looks at a product that's designed from a really Western point of view and says, I don't think they're going to understand who I am. And those things literally stop people getting the support that they need.
Great. So the other really key principle for us was we needed to make sure that our product was radically accessible, just taking into consideration who our audience was. It wasn't enough to do the usual AA, AAAs approach. We really needed to take it to the next level. So, and what that meant is we needed to listen to our users. So there's no shortcut to understanding your user's context. You need to spend time listening to them. That's the only way that you're going to be able to understand that context. And we need to be able to let the users enter into the design process. They should be a constant throughout that design process. So in that diagram above, it was just playing through our process where at every point we were contacting and being in touch with our users and stakeholders. Going back to those first principles and listening to users, iterating, validating, and rinse and repeat. So it was extremely humbling for us once we'd gone through that process. And at the other end was playing back what we created to our users. What was so humbling was that they felt seen because they knew they had been heard, and what they're looking at was something reflected those needs. And these are some of the verbatim feedbacks I got from users. So people were emotional even seeing the output because it was the first time anyone had given them listened to them carefully and understood them and given them the choices they were looking for. So they'd never seen anything like this before. Nothing like this existed. And just giving them that sense of hope and confidence in a really chaotic, traumatic scenario. Part of that accessibility is also treating all your users equally. So this means that the usual Pareto principle where you would tend to expect that maybe 20% of your users would have the most value for your product, and you would spend your resources looking at those 20 users. It doesn't work in this scenario because we can't afford to leave anyone behind at all. And usually when you're sort of building up your personas, you might have 2 or 3 personas at maximum that you would focus on, knowing that, yes, there are other users, but these 2 or 3 personas is what we need to focus on. But in our case, we had 10 personas, and we couldn't afford to not consider leave anyone behind. So we had 10 personas we had to account for. And a good example is that it's very likely that a user whose situation means that they struggle to access digital products, that they'd be the most challenged by a digital product, that might be the user who is in fact in most need of help with that digital product. So that is the kind of tension that we're working with. And what we found was interesting was that simplicity itself gave us the greatest gains in terms of accessibility. So it means, the processes that were currently in place, were by and large paper-based, very onerous, required going to a physical location, taking time out, hoping that you'd get the opportunity to speak to someone, and relying on those stretched workers to facilitate your access to the resources and benefits. And that was what we were facing. And we think about, what is the least amount of information required to get people into a system? What is the least amount of work we would need them to do? And what is the simplest and quickest route to get a user to starting to experience value? So rather than blocking them by really complicated processes, what can we do to overcome that? And can they do this all on a mobile phone by themselves, wherever they are? So the before view was something like this. It was six dense A4 pages. So that was your form, was 6 pages with over 100 questions. You needed to have documentation, your ID documents, which more than one. Which, if you're homeless, you may not easily have those with you. And those questions also involve a lot of difficult, triggering questions, really. And so that was that was where we started, and what we are looking to do, and where we landed was something quite different, which is having an online mobile-friendly form with only 6 simple questions, no documentation required, no logging in or creating an account was optional, and the questions that we did ask were easy and also optional. So we didn't lock anyone out if they couldn't answer or felt like at that particular point there was a question that they didn't want to answer. We didn't lock them out. They could still get in. And what was really surprising for me was how extreme the response was from our users once we showed them the prototypes. I'm not exaggerating that every single user, every single one was themselves so surprised about what we were showing them. I mean, the responses were, "Is that it? Is that all I need to do?" So that's what we're looking at. But obviously, just because you want to make something simple, doesn't mean that you can throw the complexity away. You can't just shove the complexity under the rug and hope it make it someone else's problem. There are obviously really important reasons why the complexity exists in the first place. Things like, making sure people are matched with the right services, and managing a risk is a big one. So, the complexity exists for a reason, but does it have to happen where it's currently happening, right at the start of a process that unlocks value, where maybe 1 or 2 people, because the process is so complex, can get through. So what we were looking at was, to simplify our product, was can we defer the complexity? Can we relocate it? And so by making the initial onboarding as simple as possible, a lot more users can start to unlock the value of the benefits and resources. And then by pushing the complexity back to where it is absolutely required, we're going to have trust is going to be built up between the parties, and there will be a greater willingness to participate with services. And so hopefully, even once the complex processes need to be reached, there will be more people making it through to the full benefits. One of the other interesting things was, and it's pretty obvious, but it certainly became very clear that words are critical, especially when you are creating an experience and an interface that is so simple. And in this particular context, the language you use is critical, because words can be triggering and they can be confusing and they can be scary to people. So you need to, we realized we needed to be very careful on how we use them. So the way we did that was to obviously start off trying to be as clear as possible, but then also working with UX copywriters to make it even clearer, and then taking it back to users and going, what do you think about this? What is this telling you? How do you feel when you're reading that? And then even going through all of that, still catching the few odd bits of language that we assumed were clear, were taken, in a way, perhaps in a very extreme literal way, and was the opposite meaning from what we intended. Yeah, so that was that. There we go.
So the next thing we we realised, this kind of complexity with users in this space. We can't pretend that all users will find a digital solution palatable, or that they're going to be able to use it. And so our solution had to connect people with others. And this is highly relational work. Getting results for people experiencing homelessness is about relationship. And so we watched some users with their technology, and particularly the most at risk, and there were definitely points at which they would give up. They would hit even the most beautiful, simple screens that Pascal had developed, and they would hit one and they'd be like, that's enough, I've done, And so being able to then offboard those people into relationship and into people as quickly as we could. The back end of the system, it allows a worker to continue to complete forms for people so that somebody can actually say, it's too much, I can't do it. But we were also really thinking about kind of the user who is sitting alongside a worker, what we call facilitated access. And you might think of that like as when you're trying to help your mum use the remote control on the television, you know what I mean? How can we design for facilitated access for these kind of people? What's the thinking that we need to do to make sure that a product can have someone else doing it for you? So our product does allow people to give up and call someone. It gives people full control over those relationships. But we also have ways that consent really works in these in the application. So it allows people to choose the services who are getting their information, but just as easily pull it away, so that they have ultimate control over how they can change consent just by click of a button. The next principle we found here was about hope. So one of our lived experience participants is on our lived experience design team who tracks the whole project. The first thing he said in a meeting, he said, this thing has to give people hope. And it became almost our mantra for the whole project, is how can we have it give it hope? And why did we need to do that? The reason we needed to do that is because 9,000 people are homeless on any one night in Western Australia. There are 4,000 households on the priority waiting list for housing. So the priority waiting list is the wait list you go on when your situation is so dire that being homeless really impacts your safety. That's 43 weeks is the wait time for that. Okay? So this is the social housing stock we have. It's got worse. So there's a big building process now. People are really working to try to up our social housing stock because it's so dire. Every co-design process I'm in now, I'm hearing about people putting up tents in backyards in places like Mandurah and Rockingham. They're popping up everywhere now. This is Western Australia, Perth, one of the richest places in the world. So there was a real problem for us here, is that people might jump on this app, and every time they jumped on this app, it said, sorry, nothing available. So how do we manage hope in that situation? And the way that we manage hope here is that we have to connect our solution to the wider system. And so it has to speak to the existing amazing service delivery that's already in the system, and it has to be able to connect people into that. Van Patter at Humantific, some of you would have seen this before, about the need for design to stretch beyond the service delivery, the products, and into the systems that we're working with. And so throughout this process, we've been considering how do we stretch this into the systems, who do we need to talk to so that it is embedded in those systems. And it's in these places where we start to find hope. Because what we can do is we can stretch the journey from this single touch point, which says, sorry, no accommodation, and say, sorry, no accommodation, here's who else you can talk to. Or this is how we establish a longer term journey about housing. Housing can be a journey. We're going to put you on that journey. There's some hope in that. But we have to engage with the system if we're going to do that. So, our conclusion. Things we think we've learnt that we think should apply to UX and to product development as a whole. First, you've got to co-design with users. Secondly, you've got to think about your edge cases. The damage is done in the edge cases. We have to have the courage to simplify. We have to have our products strengthen human relationships. We have to consider the wider system, and overall we have to provide hope. Thank you very much.